So, let me start by saying that this won't be the same type of video that you might be used to seeing on this channel. So, if you clicked on this expecting a long and detailed summary of the book itself, you're not going to get it. Why? Because this book is an absolute gem and you should read it for yourself. Although, as you can probably tell by the length of this video, I will be talking about it in some detail, so mild spoiler warnings from this timestamp and heavy spoiler warnings from this timestamp. Now, let's get straight into it. If you don't know, The Other Bennet Sister is a novel written by Janice Hadlow and was published in 2020. It follows Mary Bennet, the most overlooked of the Bennet sisters, from the beloved classic Pride and Prejudice. I will admit, I went into this slightly skeptical. I've tried reading quite a few historical novels written in modern times, and very few of them have succeeded in truly capturing the essence of their time period. Think of it like the literary equivalent to iPhone face, as in when actors in historical dramas look like they know what an iPhone is. Sometimes you just feel like a book has a modern setting, with the exception that there's no modern technology. Like that is the only clue to it not being set in modern times. I'm sure you know what I mean. If you're a fan of Jane Austen, as well as other classical works, then you might have an appetite, let's say, that's not so easily satisfied when it comes to historical works of fiction. And in that case, let me introduce you to this wonderful book, The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. And let us start with the first sentence. It is a sad fact of life that if a young woman is unlucky enough to come into the world without expectations, she had better do all she can to ensure she is born beautiful. Can you feel it? The echo of Pride and Prejudice. It gave me goosebumps reading this for the first time. This book shows you in the very first sentence what it is. It mirrors its predecessor in this perfectly crafted way. Because, as we all know, Pride and Prejudice has an iconic first sentence that captures the spirit of the book perfectly. And I honestly can't imagine a better way to introduce a story like this. So, what is the story? The book starts many years prior to the events of Pride and Prejudice, and we get to know Mary, the middle Bennet sister, as she figures out her status level within the family. Her two older sisters, Jane and Elizabeth, are besties and are both very beautiful, and they make up their own unit. And her two younger sisters, Kitty and Lydia, are also very beautiful. Although the youngest sister, Lydia, has a very dominant personality, whereas Kitty is more of a follower. Mary speculates that if Lydia had been more gentle of spirit, let's say, then she might have had a chance of making friends with Kitty. But alas, she's not. So these two make up their own unit, meaning Mary is left alone in the middle. While this is a harsh truth for her to accept, she also learns at an early age that she's unfortunately plain. To put it nicely. She overhears her mother and her aunt talking about this as a young girl, and it sticks with her, obviously. Especially given how much her sisters were praised for their good looks. And the story then flashes forward to approximately where Pride and Prejudice starts. When I was reading, I had the impression that this book was just going to be Pride and Prejudice told from Mary's perspective, with maybe a little bit more afterwards, but I was quite wrong in that. And here's where I give the first spoiler warning, so if you'd like to read it for yourself first, completely blind, then come back when you're finished. So the book is kind of Pride and Prejudice told from Mary's perspective, but only part 1, which is about 45% of it. I'm not exactly sure because I read it as a paperback and I'm using my eyes as measurement. So this means that part 1 is a bit like greeting an old dear friend and enjoying learning about a different side of them. Watching things or reading things from Mary's perspective is really interesting, and we see how our beloved characters are viewed through her eyes. And here we can find some striking differences. First up, Mrs. Bennet. In Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet is a bit of a comic relief. She's described as pretty ridiculous, lacking self-insight, and quite overbearing. But that was mostly through Elizabeth's perspective. In this book, Mrs. Bennet was a lot more cruel than I had expected. At first I thought it was unrealistic, but then I remembered that this is Mary's perspective, and if you look deeper, Mrs. Bennet does have these tendencies in Pride and Prejudice, even if they're not as intense and highlighted as they are here. Because if you look at some of Mrs. Bennet's lines, they are almost ridiculously cruel and abusive. Just out of nowhere, she would say some really mean things to Mary, or about Mary, which was still in her presence. And yes, she's a dramatic character. We all know this. But her cruelty in Pride and Prejudice was usually tied to something happening around her. She reacts rather than acts, if you know what I mean. But here, it's like she really hates Mary. She's so shallow that she finds the one daughter who isn't conventionally attractive as a personal slight. And it's really heartbreaking to read. On top of that, we have Mary as the POV, which would only amplify everything her mother did or said that was hurtful, as she's already so starved for affection and attention. And unfortunately, the same pattern goes for her sisters. Mr. Bennet. I have to admit, this one gave me quite the powerful impression, because us Pride and Prejudice fans know Mr. Bennet as this witty, delightfully sarcastic, albeit sweet man who prefers to hang out alone in his library. And you still see this side of him here, but the sweet-natured side isn't as visible. Because he has no real affection for Mary. She knows this, and it grieves her. Since she had given up a long time ago in gaining her mother's affection, Mary tries with Mr. Bennet, but in the end it was in vain. He never saw her for who she truly was, and had he nurtured her potential, especially since she was interested in reading and learning, then they could have had a close relationship. I think that anyone who has struggled with getting approval from a parent would relate to this. I know I certainly did. And there was also an element of jealousy here, as he clearly favored Elizabeth over anyone else. Which brings us to Elizabeth. During some of Elizabeth's scenes, I also had the feeling that this was an exaggerated version of her. And then I reminded myself that she reflected all of Mary's insecurities, which made them more prevalent in Mary's perspective. Her liveliness, for example, is mentioned so many times it almost becomes annoying. And then you remember that it's all Mary's perspective. This is how she sees her sister, as a representation of what she will never be. For example, when playing the pianoforte, Mary is meticulous and is devoted to her practice, playing carefully to make sure that there are no mistakes. And she compares this to when Elizabeth plays. It is more wild, lively, and there are mistakes. But she still admires it because of her spirit when she plays. And then we have a situation where Mary, who only reads non-fiction and doesn't think that novels have anything to teach, To which Elizabeth responds, "For me, that is one of their chief recommendations. I do not care to be told what to think at every turn of a page, and I do not agree that they have nothing to tell us. These are works in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature is displayed, the greatest powers of the mind described. No, I cannot sit by and leave the novel undefended." Later in the book, Mary does expand her reading to include poetry, which is a nice bit of development, but I don't think she does with novels. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think her stance on novels remains rather indifferent throughout the book, which I suppose is a bit of a missed opportunity for development. Again, there are a lot of impressions throughout part 1 of the book that relates to Mary's insecurities, all of them culminating in 2 things. One being her seeing herself as the most suitable match for Mr. Collins, and the other being her humiliation at the Netherfield ball. I'm assuming here that all of you watching know Pride and Prejudice by heart, but yes, the event that took place at the Netherfield ball is where Mary had played the piano and also decided to sing, despite having limited training in singing, which turned out to be a grave mistake, and Mr. Bennet had walked up to her, telling her to stop, basically. She carried this humiliation with her for a long time, and not receiving any support from Lizzie in particular made her very disappointed, because Lizzie had been her favorite sister, and if anyone was to show her support, she thought it would be her. And she didn't, because frankly she was far more concerned with Mr. Darcy asking her to dance for the first time. The one character that Mary actually confides in during this time, both surprisingly and unsurprisingly, is Charlotte Lucas. And this friendship was a match I never knew I needed, because it simply makes sense. Mary is plain compared to her sisters, and thus is given no attention, and no one thinks of her as having any marriage prospects. And then we have Charlotte, who's 27 years old.
I'm 27 years old.
And is on the threshold of becoming a spinster. And here I am at 36, having no issues at all with being single. How times have changed. So yes, Charlotte confides in Mary, and she understands her in a way that Lizzie never could. Because Lizzie is beautiful and lively, she could never understand Charlotte's predicament and deep anxieties. But Mary can. Mary sees Charlotte as a potential future, almost. Or at least until she marries Mr. Collins. And I just really loved exploring their friendship and understanding of one another. They have so much more in common than Elizabeth and Charlotte do, and it was just a natural step for this novel, I think. And not only that, it made the situation of Mr. Collins somewhat more complicated. As if it needed to be. Because Mary had her sights on him as well as Charlotte, although she didn't love him, of course. She had barely interacted with him. She had realized that she and Mr. Collins were of similar disposition. They both enjoyed Fordyce's sermons and things like that. So she made the correct assumption that she would be the best fit for him compared to her sisters. But then there was the problem of her looks, and Jane and Elizabeth were far more appealing to him in regards to beauty, which made him practically blind to the likes of Mary. And this situation is particularly heartbreaking because, as we know, Charlotte put herself out there after Lizzie refusing his proposal, which ended up with him proposing to her instead. But in this book, we see everything from Mary's perspective and how she tried to gain Mr. Collins's attention, but never really succeeding because she was always in the shadow of her sisters. Whereas Charlotte When she presented herself to him with the intention of gaining his affection, she appeared as a solitary figure. He had no prior connection to her family. And this, especially after the humiliation that was Lizzie's refusal, was exactly what he wanted. And Mary watched all of this happen, seeing Charlotte at work before any of the others realized it. Because she knew Charlotte in a way that the others didn't. That's why Elizabeth was so shocked by her best friend suddenly being engaged to him. Mary, on the other hand, was not. She wasn't exactly happy by it, but she understood. Then we flash forward 2 years into the future. The events of Pride and Prejudice are done with, so Jane is married to Mr. Bingley and are living up north, and Elizabeth is now Mrs. Darcy and they have a toddler son named Fitzwilliam. This marks part 2 of the book with an event we all saw coming, but none of us looked forward to. And here is my second spoiler warning. Consider yourselves warned. The death of Mr. Bennet. He passed away quite suddenly, and thus Longbourn was inherited by Mr. and Mrs. Collins. At this point, the only Bennet residents that were left there were Mrs. Bennet and Mary, because Kitty had of course also married. So what now? Mary was about 20 or 21 years old, but suddenly without a stable home, and now begins her search for not only a home and purpose, but an identity outside the context of her family home. The thing is, Mary is a bit of a late bloomer. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's quite common. But I think this trope is beautifully done here. It's a slow progress and you do get frustrated with her from time to time, but she does eventually reach a level of confidence where she can even speak up to the likes of Caroline Bingley, and in terms of historical fiction, that is a final boss if I ever saw one. So without going into too much detail, Mary goes to live with various members of her immediate and extended family. First with Jane, then with Lizzie, then Mr. and Mrs. Collins, after they've moved to Longbourn, and eventually ends up with her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, in London. Each visit, or extended stay rather, has a strong impact on Mary. She watches her hosts and analyzes their marriages, and it gives the reader an interesting view into the lives of characters that have been dormant for more than 200 years. It's such a brilliant take, honestly. As a fan of Pride and Prejudice, you can't help but relish in the enjoyment of revisiting these characters. And to be honest, Janice Hadlow has done an excellent job in capturing the essence of them. The best and most memorable for me was probably Charlotte. I very much enjoyed seeing more of her during the scenes that we already know from Pride and Prejudice. I very much enjoyed seeing more of her during the scenes that we already know from Pride and Prejudice. Been saying that way too much this video. And when we see her again as Mistress of Longbourn, that is such a striking impression. As a settled wife, mother, and mistress of her own home, she's almost quite intimidating. In my view, Janice Hadlow captured Charlotte perfectly. The best out of all the characters in the book. We see so much more of Charlotte and understand her personality and motives a lot more. The whole situation at Longbourn, after the Collinses have taken over, is very interesting in general, especially when it comes to Mr. Collins and his attention to Mary. If you haven't read it yet, I'll leave you hanging on that one. But then we have London, and Mary finally has family members, in particular Mrs. Gardiner, who see her for who she is, are invested in her, and want her to be happy and reach her full potential. You know, like her parents should have done. But anyway, Mrs. Gardiner takes Mary under her wing, gives her a makeover and starts introducing her around affluent London society. Enter Mr. Hayward and Mr. Ryder. Now, it wouldn't be a Jane Austen type of novel without at least two potential marriage candidates. And from the start, these two feel like the typical one will be a love interest and the other will be a villain trope. And I'll be honest, throughout almost the whole book, I was adamantly sure that she would end up with the John character that made her first pair of glasses when she was 18. The book keeps on referencing him, so it was a bit of a Chekhov's gun situation. Or a red herring. A Chekhov's herring, if you will. This part of the book also sees the re-emergence of Caroline Bingley, because for some reason she has her eye on Mr. Ryder and sees Mary as her rival. This leads to plenty of social gatherings where she bullies Mary in both subtle and some obvious ways, and no one stands up to her. It's a little bit frustrating. So Hayward and Ryder were... I was going to say interesting, but I changed my mind. Ryder is refreshing rather than interesting. He has some views that are quite ahead of his time, and this is a bit of a problem since Mary has great chemistry with him, but isn't particularly non-traditional in her views. Except for studying Greek, quite the controversial subject for a girl at the time. And Hayward is quite similar to Mary, but he's also a bit too careful for her liking. And at this point, she's evolved into a more confident version of herself. And as her confidence grows, his caution becomes a bigger issue. Which brings me to the ending. So the book is quite predictable in the fact that Mary ends up with Tom Hayward. They're obviously very well suited and all that, and it is quite satisfactory to see them reunite after the whole misunderstanding from the Lake Strip. But, first of all, I have some opinions on the whole Ryder resolution. So he approaches her with the proposition that they should live in sin together in Italy without actually clarifying what he is suggesting. This I find very unlikely, since Mary hasn't expressed any clear hints that she approves of a libertine lifestyle, and as she is the daughter of a gentleman, Ryder in turn could never assume that she approves without her explicit, literal approval. And she has given him none of that whatsoever for him to be encouraged to ask her to live with him at all. So that is one thing I find rather unbelievable. The second thing I find unbelievable is that he would simply marry Caroline Bingley after being rejected by Mary. Firstly, he doesn't really like her, or at least doesn't have the chemistry that obviously is important to him given how much he wanted Mary. And secondly, he had no desire for a wife. He only considered it because he wanted Mary. And as we know Caroline, she would never agree to move to Italy with a man without being married to him. And this is mentioned in the book as well. And as much as I liked seeing Hayward and Mary unite at the end, I was quite disappointed that he only dared approach her with his feelings after having received a letter from Caroline Bingley, explaining the whole situation. Mary was so frustrated by his cautious nature, and here we are learning that he remained cautious until the very end. This would have been such a good opportunity for character growth, where he should have trusted her feelings for him and gone to propose based on that. So I guess I find the ending a bit loosely tied, if that makes sense, but that doesn't take away the fact that this book is a delightful read, and that is my final opinion. I could probably go on for much longer, honestly. There was just so much to talk about this book, which is hardly surprising, to be fair. Look at the size of it. Now, on to some exciting news. It looks like this book is currently being made into a miniseries by the BBC, if I'm not mistaken. I had a quick look at the cast, and I can't say I know too many of these faces. Mary will be played by Ella Brucoleri, which I find an intriguing choice. She's prettier than I imagined Mary, of course, but has more of an unconventional beauty. It will be interesting to see what she makes of it. Oh, and Indira Varma will be fun as Mrs. Gardner for sure. I will definitely watch this when it comes out. You know, as long as they don't completely butcher the historical setting with atrocities like free-flowing hair. Looking at you, Persuasion 2022. I'm still boycotting that one. So yeah, now I would like to know, have you read The Other Bennet Sister as well, and what are your thoughts? Please share them in the comments below, as I would love to read them. And don't forget to give the video a little like, as it lets me know that you enjoyed it, which is very helpful, and it makes me happy. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time.